The cold in this part of Maine has a weight to it. It's not just a number on a thermometer. It's a physical presence that settles in your bones and stays there until the spring thaw. This winter had come early and angry, burying the Bigelow Range under a thick, unforgiving blanket of snow before Thanksgiving. The wind, a restless spirit tearing through the skeletal arms of birch and pine, had sculpted the drifts into alien shapes and polished the ice on the logging roads to a black, treacherous sheen. Every step was a gamble, a loud crunch that could either be solid snow or a thin crust over a hidden pit of freezing water. Sound didn't travel far here. It was swallowed by the sheer mass of the forest, absorbed by the snow-laden boughs of ancient firs that had stood sentinel for centuries. This was a land that didn't care for men, a place where silence was the loudest warning you could get. My cabin, the Walker cabin, stands on a low rise overlooking a frozen creek. Built by my great-grandfather from timber he felled himself. The logs are dark with age and creosote, the gaps chinked with moss and mud that my father and I replaced every few years. It's more of a fort than a home, a small bastion against the wilderness. Inside, the air smells of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, clean scent of gun oil. A stone fireplace, big enough to roast a deer, dominates the single large room, its mantelpiece cluttered with generations of Walker history, faded photographs, a collection of hand-carved animal figures, and my father's old hunting knife, its blade still keen. This cabin is the only home I've ever known. It's where I learned to track, to hunt, and to manage the other, older inheritance that flows through my veins. It is a legacy of blood and moonlight, a gift that demands a heavy price. I am a guardian of that gift. Walker men, for as long as our stories go back, have carried the wolf within them. We are not the monsters of campfire tales, driven by mindless rage. We are, or we are supposed to be, keepers. My father taught me the rules before I could even properly hold a rifle. Control is everything. The change is a torrent, a primal flood of strength and instinct, and you are the dam. You hold it back, you channel it, you never let it break you. You never, ever let the rage take over. And the most sacred rule? The one carved into the very soul of our bloodline. Never feed on the flesh of man. To do so is to shatter the dam forever, to let the monster out and lose the man. We are protectors of these mountains, not their predators. The disappearances started quietly, as they always do. A tourist from Massachusetts whose vehicle was found abandoned at the trailhead for Avery Peak. Then a pair of local hunters, seasoned men who knew these woods better than their own backyards, vanished without a trace 2 weeks later. I'd heard the talk from Dave, one of the park rangers who occasionally drove his snowmobile up the old logging trail to check on me. He'd sat by my fire, his face etched with worry, nursing a cup of hot coffee. "It's weird, Ethan," he'd said, his voice low. "No tracks, no signs of a struggle. It's like the woods just opened up and swallowed them. We've got search parties combing every inch, but with this fresh powder we're finding nothing. It's spooking people." I nodded, offering him nothing more than a concerned frown, but my gut was clenching. I knew what kind of predator left no evidence, one that didn't want to be found. A few days after Dave's visit, I found them, the tracks. I was checking my perimeter, a 3-mile loop I walked every morning, when I saw the indentations cutting across my own path in the snow. They were wrong, all wrong. They weren't from a bear long since hibernating or a moose. They were long and unnaturally narrow, as if made by something gaunt, skeletal. The stride was huge, impossibly so, suggesting towering, emaciated limbs. And at the end of each print were the faint, sharp scratches of claws, Not the healthy claws of a predator, but something broken and splintered, dragging through the ice. The creature that made these tracks was starving, desperate and profoundly unnatural. It moved with a lurching, disjointed gait, a parody of a human walk. A cold dread, colder than the wind, snaked its way up my spine. My father's words came back to me then, a memory as sharp and clear as the winter air. We were skinning a buck behind the cabin, the steam rising from the carcass into the frigid evening. He'd looked at me, his eyes serious, and said, "The change is a hunger, son. A clean hunger for the hunt. But there's another kind of hunger out here. A winter hunger. It comes when a man is lost, starving, alone in the dark. It whispers to him, offers him a way to survive. And if he listens, if he eats the flesh of his own kind to live, he becomes something else, something broken. The old stories call it Wendigo. For our kind, for the walker blood, the fall is even worse. The wolf inside us can't bear that corruption. It shatters. What's left is just the hunger, a walking, screaming hunger that can never be filled." The time for waiting was over. The tracks were proof that the whispers were real, that one of the old horrors had awakened in my woods. I couldn't let it hunt here. I couldn't let it take another soul. This was my territory, my responsibility. Tonight, the moon would be a slim, silver crescent. Not enough to force a full change, but enough to sharpen the senses, to lend strength to my limbs. Tonight, I would not be a man in a cabin. I would be a hunter. I would go into the deep woods and find the source of this wrongness. I would determine the scale of the threat, and I would face the starving thing that stalked the silent forests of Maine. The world before dawn is a study in shades of gray and blue. The biting wind had died down, leaving an unnerving stillness over the forest. The only sounds were the whisper of my insulated gear and the rhythmic thump-thump of my own heart, a steady drum against the silence. I'd been moving for hours, following the grotesque tracks under the faint, ethereal glow of the crescent moon and the stars. They led me north, away from the familiar hunting grounds and deeper into the rugged, untamed heart of the range. The trail was a testament to the creature's madness. It didn't follow game trails or logical paths. It crashed through dense thickets of spruce, scrambled over icy rock faces, and staggered in looping, nonsensical patterns as if the thing itself was at war with its own mind. It was a trail of pure desperation. Just as the first hint of pale light began to stain the eastern sky, the scent hit me. Copper. A thick, metallic stench of blood, so potent it was almost a taste on the back of my tongue. It cut through the clean, cold air like a blade. I slowed my pace, unslinging the heavy caliber rifle from my shoulder, its cold metal a familiar and grim comfort in my hands. A few hundred yards further, I found the source. It was, or had been, a bull moose. A magnificent animal, easily over 1,000 pounds, now reduced to a horrific tableau of slaughter. It lay in a crater of churned, blood-soaked snow. Its hide was peeled back in huge, ragged strips. Chunks of flesh were ripped from its flanks and shoulders, torn away with a terrifying brute force. But the strange part, the part that made the hair on my arms stand up, was that very little of the meat had been eaten. It was a killing of rage, not of hunger. A frenzy. The bloody snow told a story. The Wendigo's tracks were everywhere, overlapping in a chaotic dance of violence. But leading away from the carnage was a single clear trail. A crimson path of drips and smears leading up into the high, stony hills that formed the spine of Applegate Ridge. The creature was wounded, or at the very least covered in its victim's blood. I followed, my senses on high alert. The landscape here was different, starker, more exposed. The dense forest gave way to scattered wind-blasted pines clinging to granite outcrops. The air was thinner, colder. I moved from boulder to boulder using the terrain for cover, my rifle ready. A low guttural sound drifted down from the rocks above, a wet, rattling growl that was nothing like a bear or a wolf. It was the sound of a throat ruined by screaming. And then I saw it. It was perched on a ledge about 50 yards above me, silhouetted against the rising sun. The stories, my father's warnings, had not prepared me for the reality. It was a thing of nightmare geometry. Tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs were elongated to the point of absurdity, like a man stretched on a rack. Its skin was the color of old bruises, pulled taut over a skeletal frame, so translucent I could almost see the dark shapes of its organs beneath. Patches of thin black hair clung to its scalp and back. It was hunched over, gnawing on something, a piece of the moose, I realized, with frantic, jerking motions. As I watched, it lifted its head, and its face turned towards me. The face was the worst part. A long, equine skull with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Yet I felt its gaze lock onto me. Its lipless mouth was a jagged gash filled with yellowed, broken teeth. It let out another sound, and I realized what it was. It was a sob. A choked, distorted, utterly human sound of agony, trapped within a monstrous form. I raised my rifle, the crosshairs settling on the center of its chest. But before I could pull the trigger, it lunged. It didn't climb down the rocks. It fell, collapsing in on itself and flowing down the rock face like a river of broken bones, its joints bending at impossible angles. It hit the snow below and immediately sprang up, charging me with that horrifying, lurching gait. I fired. The shot boomed across the ridge, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The bullet hit it square in the chest, staggering it. A dark, tar-like fluid seeped from the wound, but it didn't slow down. It just screamed, a high, piercing shriek of fury and pain. It closed the distance in seconds. I barely had time to brace myself before it was on me, its splintered claws swiping at my face. I threw myself back, the claws catching the sleeve of my jacket and tearing it open. Its stench was overpowering, a charnel house miasma of rot and old blood. In the frantic chaos of the struggle, as I fought to bring my rifle around to use as a club, its left hand shot out and grabbed my shoulder. And I saw it. On the back of its gaunt gray hand, just below the wrist, was a scar. It wasn't a random mark. It was a jagged starburst pattern, a birthmark I knew as well as my own reflection. I had an identical one on my right hand. It was the Walker family mark, a unique pattern passed down through my father's side for generations. My blood went cold. This was not just some random monster born of a lost hunter. This thing, this screaming, broken thing, was family. The shock of the realization froze me for a heartbeat. It was all the creature needed. It shoved me back with incredible strength, sending me tumbling into a deep snowdrift, and then it turned. With that same disjointed, impossibly fast movement, it scrambled away, disappearing into a thick bank of morning fog that was rolling up through the valley below. I lay in the snow, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. My mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but it had changed everything. I wasn't just hunting a monster anymore. I was hunting a ghost from my own family tree. The stories my father told weren't just cautionary tales. They were a history, a prophecy of what we could become. The whispers of the winter hunger had claimed one of my own. I looked at the starburst scar on my own hand, then back towards the fog where the creature had vanished. The quiet woods no longer felt like my sanctuary. They felt like a tomb filled with the lost and broken members of my own kin. And I was the keeper of that tomb. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls as I hunched over my father's journal. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with his neat, steady script. He had given it to me on my 16th birthday, the night of my first change. "Everything you need to know is in here," he'd told me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "But the most important lessons aren't written in ink. They're written in blood. Our blood." Now, I ran my fingers over the brittle paper, searching for answers for anything that could explain the scarred creature on the ridge. I found the passage I was looking for in a section titled "The Laws of Balance." "The wolf is not a curse," he had written. "It is a force of nature like a river. A river can irrigate a field or it can flood a village. The choice lies with the man who builds the levees. Our laws are those levees. Never surrender to rage, for rage is the first crack in the dam. Never shed the blood of the innocent, and never, under any circumstance, taste the flesh of thinking creatures. To do so is to invite an older, colder hunger into your soul. It is to become a flood that drowns everything, including yourself." I closed my eyes, the memory of my own trial washing over me. It's a rite of passage for every walker, the night we truly meet the wolf inside. My father took me to the shore of Flagstaff Lake, a vast, man-made lake that had drowned several small towns decades ago. Even today, on clear days, you can sometimes see the ghostly outline of a church steeple beneath the surface. He built a bonfire on the rocky shore, and as the full moon climbed over the horizon, its light painting the water in a sheet of shimmering silver, the change began. It was a fire in my bones, a glorious, terrifying agony as my body reshaped itself. He didn't restrain me. That was the point. The test was one of will. As the beast took hold, its instinct screaming for a hunt for dominance, I had to find the core of myself, the human part, and hold on. I remember the scent of deer in the woods, the primal urge to run, to kill. I spent that entire night pacing the shoreline, a great gray wolf fighting a war within my own skin. When dawn came and the change receded, I was exhausted but whole. I had held the line. My father had simply nodded, a look of grim pride in his eyes. Our family had always lived this way, apart from the world, in quiet isolation. We were the Walkers, a name that felt both literal and symbolic. We walked the mountains. We walked the line between man and beast. The locals in the nearest town, Stratton, thought of us as reclusive, odd, but harmless. They saw us as relics, a family of old-school trappers and woodsmen who simply preferred the company of trees to people. They had no idea of the truth, that our seclusion was a necessity, a quarantine. We were the guardians of these mountains, not just from outside threats, but from the threat buried deep within our own DNA. We kept the beast contained so the world would never have to see it. It was a lonely, thankless duty passed from father to son through generations. The scar on the Wendigo's hand haunted me. It was a walker mark. That meant a walker had fallen. I began to comb through the journal, my search now more desperate, and then I found the entry that made my heart stop. It was dated 15 years ago in the dead of winter. It spoke of my grandfather, Jacob Walker. He was a man I barely remembered, a towering figure with a wild beard and eyes that seemed to see right through you. The official story was that he'd been caught in a sudden blizzard while checking his trap lines and was never found. But my father's journal told a different story. "Jacob is gone," the entry read. "He didn't come back from the northern range. He's been different this last year, more withdrawn." He spoke of the fraying, of the wolf's voice growing louder in his head. He feared a lunar schism, his term for losing the fight, for the man and beast breaking apart. He was terrified of the winter hunger, said he could feel it calling to him on the wind. A schism, a breaking apart. The words echoed the horrific, disjointed movements of the creature I'd fought. Could it be? Could that thing on the ridge have been my grandfather? 15 years of starvation and madness, twisted into that skeletal mockery of a man. The thought was nauseating. My own grandfather, a legend in our family for his strength and control, had succumbed to the very corruption he'd taught my father to fear. The idea seemed impossible, a betrayal of everything our family stood for. But the scar was undeniable proof. It had to be him, or at least what was left of him. This changed the nature of my hunt. I wasn't just dealing with a single recent event. This was a family problem, a sickness in my bloodline. How many others had there been? My father's journal mentioned a great-uncle who'd walked into the snows in the 1940s, a cousin of my grandfather's who vanished in the 70s. Were they all out there too? Broken things, haunting the deep woods? I pulled out an old, detailed topographical map of the region and spread it across the wooden table. Using the journal and town records I'd accessed on my rare trips to the library, I began to mark the locations of every unexplained disappearance in Franklin County over the last century. I cross-referenced them with the Walker family tree, a document my father had meticulously maintained. A pattern began to emerge. A grim, terrifying constellation of loss. The disappearances of my relatives, and many of the other local vanishings, all seemed to cluster around a specific, remote area of the mountains. A place the old maps called the Devil's Jaw, a treacherous series of canyons and ravines that even seasoned hunters avoided. And at the heart of this cluster was one landmark, a place I'd only heard about in hushed stories from my father. A massive frozen waterfall known locally as North Falls. All the tracks, all the stories, all the missing pieces of my family's cursed history, they were all pointing to the same place. The trek to North Falls took the better part of a day. A grueling journey through knee-deep snow and treacherous ice-slicked game trails. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, as I pushed deeper into the Devil's Jaw. The mountains closed in around me, their granite peaks like jagged teeth against a steel-gray sky. This was old country, primal and untouched. There were no signs of logging, no trails marked by park services. There was only the wind, the snow, and the unnerving feeling of being watched by something ancient and malevolent. The tracks of the Wendigo I'd fought were here, joined by others, some fainter, almost erased by the blowing snow, but all bearing the same horrifying characteristics of emaciation and brokenness. I was on the right path. I was walking into their den. North Falls wasn't just a waterfall, it was a monument of ice. In the summer, it was a roaring cascade of water plunging over a 300-foot cliff face. In the winter, it was transformed. The entire cliff was encased in a colossal wall of frozen turquoise and white, a cathedral of ice that glittered ominously in the flat winter light. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. The air around it hummed with a strange, low-frequency vibration, the ghost of the powerful water still moving somewhere deep within the ice. As I got closer, I saw it, a dark opening near the base of the frozen cascade, partially obscured by enormous icicles that hung like the bars of a cage. It was the entrance to a cave system hidden behind the waterfall. Stepping through that opening was like entering another world. The temperature instantly rose by at least 30 degrees. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the earthy smell of damp moss, wet stone, and something else. The coppery, stomach-turning stench of old blood. The sound of the outside world vanished, replaced by a constant echoing drip of meltwater and the faint, rushing sound of the river still flowing somewhere in the deep darkness. I switched on my headlamp, its powerful beam cutting a sharp cone through the gloom. I was in a large, cavernous chamber, the walls slick with moisture and covered in thick blankets of pale, ghostly moss. The floor was a soft loam of dirt and rotting leaves, but it was littered with darker shapes, bones. Hundreds of them, mostly from deer and moose, cracked open for their marrow. As my light swept across the walls, I saw the drawings. They were ancient, etched into the stone with charcoal and ochre, primal, terrifying art. The first images depicted figures that were clearly werewolves, massive, powerful wolves standing on two legs, their forms radiating strength. They were shown hunting, running under a full moon, living in what seemed to be a savage harmony with the wild. But as I moved deeper into the cave, following the twisting passage, the drawings changed. They became more desperate, more violent. I saw depictions of a great famine, a winter that never ended. The wolves in the drawings grew thinner, their ribs showing. Then I saw the image that made my breath catch in my throat. A stick-thin figure, half wolf, half man, was shown hunched over a human form, consuming it. The act of cannibalism. That was the turning point. In the next series of drawings, the figures were no longer wolves. They were transformed into the tall, skeletal abominations I now knew as Wendigo. Their eyes were drawn as empty holes, their bodies twisted and broken. They were shown attacking the wolfmen, their own kind. It was a visual history of the fall, a chronicle of a people devouring themselves. I followed the grim gallery of images, my light revealing scene after scene of horror. One drawing showed a Wendigo being pierced by arrows, yet still standing, its arms outstretched in a silent scream. And everywhere, scattered amongst the horrific scenes, was a familiar symbol, a spiral intersected by a single sharp claw mark. The Walker family sign. It was on the wolf figures, on their crude shelters, and most chillingly, it was sometimes scratched over the faces of the Wendigo as if to mark them, to name them as fallen. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a Wendigo lair. This was a Walker sanctuary, a place where my ancestors had lived and where they had recorded their greatest shame. The Wendigo were not a separate species of monster that hunted my kind. They were my kind. They were the ones who had broken the most sacred rule. They were werewolves who, driven by starvation or madness, had committed the ultimate taboo and consumed human flesh. The lunar schism my grandfather feared wasn't just a loss of control. It was a permanent, irreversible corruption. The wolf spirit, the clean and primal force within us, couldn't withstand it. It shattered, leaving behind only the insatiable, mindless hunger of the Wendigo. I stood there in the humid, blood-scented darkness of the cave, the beam of my headlamp illuminating a fresco of damnation. My entire understanding of who and what I was had been upended. I was not just a guardian against external threats. I was the descendant of a broken people, a carrier of a bloodline that was as much a curse as it was a gift. The monsters I was hunting weren't just my family in a metaphorical sense. They were literally my blood, my ancestors, trapped in an eternal, screaming agony. The weight of generations of failure settled on my shoulders. I was the last levy, standing against a flood that had already drowned my entire lineage. My headlamp beam played over the damp stone, revealing more of the cave's grim secrets. The main chamber branched into several smaller passages, each one a dark, uninviting maw. I chose one at random, my boots sinking into the soft, loamy floor. The air in this tunnel was staler, the smell of decay more pronounced. It ended in a small, almost perfectly circular alcove, which seemed to have been a living space. There was a crude fire pit in the center, long cold, and a flattened area that might have served as a bed. My light caught a glint of something tucked into a natural niche in the wall, about waist-high. I reached in, my fingers brushing against old, cracked leather. I pulled it out. It was a belt, heavy and thick, the kind a man would wear for a lifetime. The buckle was tarnished brass, but it was the metal tag riveted to the leather that made my blood run cold. Stamped into it were 2 words, Jacob Walker. So it was true. My grandfather had come here. This was his final resting place. Or perhaps the place of his unholy rebirth. I ran my thumb over his name, the letters smooth under my skin. He hadn't just been lost in a blizzard. He had felt the change coming, the fraying as my father's journal called it, and he had come here. Had he been seeking a cure? Or had he been coming home, drawn by the same corrupted blood that flowed in the veins of the other fallen walkers? I clutched the belt in my hand, a tangible link to the man who had become the monster on the ridge. The grief was a sharp, sudden pang, a sorrow for a man I barely knew, but whose legacy of failure now defined my own mission. I pushed deeper into the cave system, driven by a morbid need to see the full extent of my family's tragedy. Another passage led to a much larger chamber, a natural ossuary. This was where they brought their dead, or what was left of them. A massive pile of bones, some yellowed with age, others still slick with decaying tissue, lay heaped against the far wall. The stench was overwhelming. My light revealed a horrifying mix of animal and human remains, but something else stood out. Scattered throughout the pile were bones that were too large, too thick to be purely human. The femurs were longer, the rib cages more massive. These were the bones of my kind, the skeletons of werewolves. The Wendigo were not only killing humans, they were preying on their own, the ones who had not yet fallen. As I scanned the bone pile, my light caught on smaller, more personal artifacts mixed in with the skeletal remains. I saw the glint of silver, a broken chain, then another and another. I recognized them immediately. They were the remnants of the amulets my father had told me about. For generations, Walker men and women had worn silver talismans, intricately carved with the spiral and claw sigil. They weren't for protection against other creatures. They were for us. The silver, in close contact with our skin, acted as a constant, low-grade suppressor, a damper on the rage and the primal instincts of the wolf. It helped us maintain control. Finding them here, broken and discarded amongst the bones, told a chilling story. The Wendigo had either destroyed the amulets of their victims, or they had torn them from their own necks as the final symbol of their surrender to the hunger. The horror of it all was beginning to feel suffocating. I looked up, trying to draw a clean breath, and my headlamp beam struck the ceiling of the chamber. It wasn't smooth stone. The entire ceiling, a vast, domed expanse, was covered in a chaotic network of scratches. Deep, savage gouges carved into the rock. At first I thought it was just random destruction, but then I saw the pattern. They were tally marks. Thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in rough, overlapping groups. A barbaric accounting. Was this a record of their kills? Or something worse? I moved closer to one wall, where the ceiling was lower. I could see the marks clearly now. They weren't just tallies. They were a calendar of damnation. Each mark, I realized with a sickening certainty, represented a fallen member of my family, a new Wendigo born into this hell. My ancestors hadn't just died here, they had been counted. This cave was not a home. It was a tomb, a monument to our failure. I was standing in the epicenter of my family's curse. The weight of it pressed down on me, the humid air thick with the ghosts of my broken kin. My mission, which had started as a simple hunt to protect the local populace, had transformed into something far more personal and profound. This wasn't about exterminating monsters. The creatures out there, the skeletal things screaming in the winter night, were not monsters. They were prisoners. They were my great-uncles, my cousins, my grandfather. Their souls trapped inside a cage of bone and hunger, condemned to an eternal, agonizing existence. My father had taught me to be a guardian, a protector. He had never told me what to do when the thing you had to protect was the memory of your own family. A new resolve hardened within me, cold and clear as the ice outside. I could not save them. I could not reverse the corruption, but I could grant them peace. My hunt was no longer about survival or secrecy. It was about mercy. It was a grim, familial duty. I would be the final chapter in their stories. I would find every last one of my broken ancestors, every fallen walker, and I would give them the only thing I had left to offer: the release of a clean, swift death. Standing in that cavern of bones and sorrow, I made a silent vow. I would become the family's euthanist. I would put an end to their suffering, no matter the cost to my own soul. The vow made in the cavern settled into my bones, a cold and heavy purpose. I left the cave of my ancestors behind, stepping back out into the biting wind and clean snow, the contrast between the two worlds jarring. I now had a focus. I was no longer just reacting. I was actively hunting. I spent 2 days tracking, using every skill my father had ever taught me. I found their patterns. They moved along the highest, most desolate ridges of the Crocker mountain range, a pack of ghosts haunting the roof of the world. There were 2 of them traveling together, their loping, unnatural tracks a clear signature in the fresh snow. I followed, keeping downwind, my movements patient and deliberate. This was not a hunt born of anger, but of sorrow. I cornered the first one in a narrow, rocky gorge as a snow squall moved in, the air thick with swirling flakes. It was smaller than the one I'd fought before, its frame more delicate, almost feminine. It didn't fight with the same mindless frenzy as the other. When it saw me, it let out a sound that was less a shriek and more a wail of despair. As I moved in, it swiped at me with its splintered claws, its movements clumsy, exhausted. The fight was short and brutal. I did not use my rifle. This felt too personal for that kind of distance. I used the heavy, silver-edged knife my father had crafted, a tool meant for ritual, not combat. When the final blow landed, the creature collapsed into the snow, and from its lipless mouth came a whisper, a single distorted syllable that sounded like a name. A name I didn't recognize, but it was a human sound, an echo of the person it once was. The second one was harder. I tracked it to the edge of a vast, frozen bog. It was larger, more powerful, and it fought with a desperate, cornered animal ferocity. We circled each other in the eerie twilight, two dark shapes against the endless white. It lunged and we fell, a tangle of limbs and fury. As I wrestled with the creature, its gaunt face inches from mine, I saw a flicker of something in its hollow eye sockets. Recognition. It stopped struggling for a single, heart-stopping moment. It slowly raised a skeletal hand, not with a clawed, aggressive posture, but with its palm open, reaching towards my face as if to touch a long-lost son or brother. The gesture was so profoundly human, so full of ancient memory that I almost faltered. Then the hunger took it again, and its face contorted back into a mask of rage. I ended it quickly after that, the act feeling less like a killing and more like a betrayal. As its life faded, its final, rattling breath sounded like a sigh of relief. With each soul I sent to its final rest, a change began to stir within me. The grim work was taking its toll. The rage, the primal fury of the wolf that I had spent my entire life suppressing, was beginning to bubble closer to the surface. It was a low hum beneath my skin, a coppery taste in my mouth. When I'd fought these creatures, I'd felt the thrill of the fight in a way I never had before. A dark, seductive part of me had enjoyed the raw, physical power. The clean, controlled hunt for a deer was one thing. This was a life or death struggle, a dance on the edge of savagery, and it was awakening something I had sworn to keep chained. The hunger my father had warned me about, not the Wendigo's corruption, but the wolf's own pure predatory hunger was growing stronger, less patient. I started to see the world differently. The scent of a snowshoe hare was no longer just a sign of life in the woods. It was an invitation that made my stomach clench. The sight of a distant herd of deer sent a jolt of predatory electricity through my nerves. The beast within me was restless, straining against the cage of my discipline. The form it took in my mind was no longer a partner, a part of me to be respected and managed. It was becoming a separate entity, a snarling thing in a dark corner of my soul. And it was whispering to me, telling me to let go, to embrace the power, to kill not for mercy, but for the sheer bloody joy of it. I knew I was walking a razor's edge. The path of the Wendigo began with a broken rule, but the path to losing control, to becoming a mindless monster of a different sort, began with surrendering to this rage. Recognizing the danger, I knew I had to reinforce the levees. That night, with the moon nearing its full power, I performed a ritual of my own design, a brutal act of self-preservation. I found a massive ancient oak tree, one of the oldest in the forest, its trunk thick as a small vehicle. I took out a length of heavy, silver-inlaid chain I kept for emergencies. It was a tool of last resort, a physical restraint for a spiritual battle. With trembling hands, I wrapped one end of the chain around the trunk of the tree and the other around my own torso, padlocking myself to it. I would spend the night here, chained like an animal to weather the storm inside me. As darkness fell and the lunar power grew, the change came upon me, violent and unwanted. The wolf fought the chains, its snarls echoing through the silent woods. I woke with the dawn, the change having receded, leaving me naked, shivering, and human again in the snow. My body ached, every muscle screaming in protest. I looked at the chain. It was still intact, but the silver links were deeply scored with fresh claw marks, the metal gouged and twisted where the beast had tried to rip itself free. I had spent the night fighting myself, my two halves locked in a war for control. I had held the line, but it was a victory that felt terrifyingly temporary. The scratches on the chain were a stark reminder of how close I was to the edge, how easily I could follow my ancestors down the path to ruin. I was broken in a different way, not yet fallen, but cracked, and I knew the winter was far from over. The woods were no longer quiet. The disappearances, once sporadic and easily dismissed as accidents, had accelerated. A snowmobiler vanished from a marked trail. A cross-country skier was reported missing near the Sugarloaf Ski Resort. The fear that had been a low murmur in the nearby towns was now a palpable presence. People were locking their doors, and the usual winter traffic of hunters and tourists had dwindled to almost nothing. Search parties, now larger and more heavily armed, combed the foothills, their shouts and the drone of their vehicles a constant unwelcome intrusion into my territory. The human world was pushing back against the shadows, and I was caught in the middle. One afternoon, I was returning to my cabin when I heard the distinct whine of a snowmobile engine. It was moving slowly, cautiously, up the old logging road that led to my property. I slipped behind a thicket of firs, my hand resting on the knife at my belt. A moment later, a park ranger came into view. I recognized him, though we'd never formally met. He was a senior ranger, a man with a weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes. His name tag read Mark Holloway. He wasn't part of a search party. He was alone, moving with the quiet competence of a man who spent his life in the wild. He wasn't looking for a lost tourist. He was hunting. He cut the engine a few hundred yards from my cabin, the sudden silence deafening. He dismounted and began examining the snow, his gaze missing nothing. I decided it was better to approach him on my own terms than to be discovered hiding. I stepped out from the trees, making sure my hands were visible. "Can I help you, Ranger?" I called out. He wasn't startled. He simply turned, his eyes sizing me up. "Ethan Walker?" he asked, his voice calm and even. I nodded. "I'm Mark Holloway. I was told you live out here year-round. Figured you might have seen something." He was fishing, but his gaze was sharp. He was looking for more than just an eyewitness account. "Seen a lot of worried people," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Haven't seen whatever they're looking for." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the woods around my cabin. "The thing is," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "we're not dealing with a bear coming out of hibernation early or a mountain lion. The tracks we're finding, they don't make sense. And the way the victims are taken, it's clean. Too clean. It feels more like an abduction than an animal attack." I knew I had to engage, to guide him away from the truth without raising suspicion. I offered him a cup of coffee, an old woodsman's courtesy. He accepted, and we walked back to my cabin. As I prepared the coffee on the wood stove, I played the part of the concerned local, offering theories about rogue trappers or out-of-state predators. Holloway listened patiently, but his eyes were constantly moving, taking in the details of my home, the old maps on the wall, the heavy-duty gear, the palpable sense of isolation. He was building a profile, and I knew it. Over the next week, he became a recurring presence. He'd check in, ostensibly to share updates on the search, but I knew he was watching me, studying my territory. I, in turn, used his visits to subtly steer the search parties away from the high ridges, away from the Wendigos' hunting grounds. It was a dangerous game. The breaking point came a few days later. I'd had another brutal chained night, a battle against the rising tide of my own fury. The next morning, exhausted, I found the tracks of a large Wendigo, larger than the others, uncomfortably close to the edge of my land. It had attacked a deer not a mile from my cabin. The kill was frenzied, wasteful. I knew I couldn't let it get this close to the human world. Under the cover of a brewing snowstorm, I let the change take me, not fully, but enough to grant me the speed and strength I needed. I ran the creature down, a brutal chase through the dense forest that ended in a maelstrom of tooth and claw. I killed it, but not before it left deep gashes across my lupine form. By the time I returned to my human shape, I was bleeding and bruised. The next day, Holloway showed up unannounced. "I need to show you something," he said, his face grim. He led me on his snowmobile to the site of my battle. The snow was a mess of tracks and blood. He pointed. "Look here," he said. "These are the tracks of our monster, same as the others. But look at these." He indicated a second set of prints, massive canine tracks, the tracks of the wolf. "This is the third time we've found this. A fight. Whatever is taking people is being hunted by something else. A wolf, and a damn big one. But here's the thing that's been bothering me." He walked a wide circle, pointing out the boundary of the wolf tracks. "They never leave this area. The wolf tracks are always here on this mountain, within a 5-mile radius of your cabin. It's like it's protecting this place, guarding it." He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You live in the middle of a war zone, Mr. Walker. Yet you seem completely unfazed. You hunt these woods your whole life, yet you claim to have seen nothing. A man doesn't survive out here by being unobservant." He wasn't accusing me, not directly, but the question hung in the cold air between us. He was close, dangerously close, to a truth he couldn't possibly comprehend. This ranger, with his quiet logic and keen eyes, was becoming a greater threat to my family's secret than the Wendigo themselves. But I also saw something else in his face. It wasn't just suspicion. It was a deep-seated weariness and a genuine desire to stop the killing. He had seen the fear in the community, the grief of the families. He wasn't a man driven by ambition, but by duty. He wanted to help, to protect his people, the same way I was trying to protect mine. Our purposes were aligned, even if our methods were worlds apart. I knew then that my isolation was no longer a viable strategy. The human world was closing in, and its most capable representative was standing right in front of me. Holloway's discovery forced my hand. The secrecy that had defined my family for generations was becoming untenable. But before I could decide how to handle the ranger, the Wendigo made their own move. The scattered tracks, the isolated hunts, they ceased. For 2 days, the woods fell silent. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that precedes a storm. I knew it wasn't over. They were gathering. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the psychic pressure of the mountains, a coalescing of their shared hunger and misery. I packed a light kit, my silver knife, some medical supplies, and my grandfather's belt, which I now wore buckled over my own, and headed for the high peaks, leaving the world of men and their suspicions behind me. I tracked the faint, converging trails to a place I had not been since I was a boy, the desolate, wind-scoured plateau of Burnt Hill. The name was literal. Decades ago, a lightning strike had started a fire that had incinerated the entire mountaintop, leaving behind a barren, skeletal forest of charred tree trunks. It was a dead place, a perfect throne for dead things. As I crested the final ridge, the scene below stole the breath from my lungs. On the flat, snow-dusted expanse, they were gathered. At least half a dozen of the skeletal figures, their gaunt forms like scorched saplings in the dead forest. They weren't fighting or feeding. They were simply standing, waiting, their empty gaze fixed on a single point. At the center of the gathering, perched on a large, blackened rock, was he. I knew it was him before I could even see the details. The sheer presence of the creature was immense, a vortex of ancient pain and power. It was larger than the others, its back hunched and twisted, its limbs even more grotesquely elongated. Its skin was darker, almost the color of the charred wood around it, and its movements were slower, more deliberate, possessed of a chilling, regal authority. This was the Alpha, the patriarch of this broken clan. This was Jacob, my grandfather. As I watched, he raised his head and a low, rattling sound rumbled from his chest, a command that made the other Wendigos shift and keen in response. A strange thing happened within me. The wolf, the beast I had been fighting to control, did not snarl or rise to the challenge. Instead, it recoiled. It whimpered. Deep in my soul, the primal part of me recognized its own alpha, its own blood elder, even in this corrupted, monstrous form. It was a deep, instinctual deference that I had never felt before, a terrifying urge to submit, to join the pack. It was a loyalty that transcended form, a blood memory that threatened to overwhelm my human reason. I had to physically brace myself against a tree, my knuckles white, to fight down the impulse to walk down onto that plateau and kneel. My grandfather, the thing that wore his form, seemed to sense my presence. It turned its horrifying, lipless face in my direction. It let out a long, low growl that was different from the others. It was not just a threat, it was a lament. Deep within the guttural, monstrous sound, I could hear the echo of a human voice, a rasping, agonized groan. It was the sound of a man trapped in a prison of his own flesh, screaming to be let out. He knew who I was. The part of him that was still Jacob, buried under 15 years of cannibalistic madness, recognized his grandson, and it was begging for release. In that moment, all my internal conflict, all my fear and doubt burned away, leaving only a cold, hard clarity. This was not a battle for territory or survival. It was an appointment, a tragic final family reunion. My purpose, my entire life, had led me to this dead forest on this forgotten mountain. I was here to finish what he could not, to sever the last corrupted link in a chain of suffering. My hand went to the hilt of my silver knife. I was ready to do what had to be done. "Walker!" The voice was a harsh whisper carried on the wind. I turned, my heart pounding. It was Holloway. He had followed me. He stood 20 yards behind me, his service pistol drawn but pointed at the ground, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. His eyes were wide, fixed on the tableau of monsters on the plateau. He had seen them. He had seen the truth. All the strange tracks, the missing people, the impossible stories. It all culminated in this single sanity-shattering vision. He looked from the creatures to me, his expression a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. What in God's name are they?" he breathed. "They're my family," I said, my voice hoarse. I didn't have the energy to lie anymore. The secret was out, exposed under the gray sky of Burnt Hill. "Holloway, you have to leave. Now. This is not your fight. This is a debt that my bloodline has to pay." He didn't move, his gaze locked on the scene. He was a man whose entire world, a world of logic and natural law, had just been irrevocably shattered. I couldn't worry about him now. I turned my back on him, on the human world he represented, and took the first step down toward the plateau. I was going to meet my grandfather. I was going to end this family tragedy with my own hands. The decision was made. The moment I took that first step onto the plateau of Burnt Hill, the fear vanished. The internal war, The struggle between man and beast that had plagued me for weeks fell silent. They merged. The wolf rose within me not as a torrent of rage to be contained, but as a current of power to be wielded. For the first time in my life, I did not fight the change. I invited it. It was not an act of surrender, but of acceptance. The gift of my ancestors, the very thing that had led to their damnation, would now become their salvation. My bones lengthened, my skin stretched, my senses exploded. I became the gray wolf, the guardian, my form swelling with a power born not of fury, but of profound, sorrowful purpose. I was not a monster. I was an instrument of mercy. The Wendigo turned as one, their hollow eyes fixing on my lupine form. The smaller ones shrieked, a chorus of insane rage, and charged. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white snow, black char, and gray skeletal limbs. A heavy blizzard had finally broken, the wind howling a funeral dirge around us. I met their charge. I was faster, stronger, and I fought with a clarity they had long since lost. A clawed hand swiped at me. I ducked under it, my jaws clamping down on a stick-thin arm and snapping the bone with a sickening crack. Another leaped onto my back, its broken teeth trying to find purchase on my spine. I threw myself backwards, crushing it against a blackened tree trunk. Their cries were not the roars of monsters, but the broken sobs of lost souls. With everyone I brought down, I felt not triumph, but a wave of profound pity. I was releasing them. The battle was a blur of brutal, efficient motion. I moved through them like a reaper, my silver-edged knife still clutched in a transforming hand that could grip it, flashing in the dim light. I didn't tear them apart as they had the moose. My strikes were precise, aimed to sever spinal cords, to pierce what was left of their hearts. These were not enemies to be destroyed. They were family to be put to rest. The snow around me became stained with their dark, tar-like blood, the only color in the monochrome landscape. One by one, they fell, their final rattling breaths steaming in the frigid air before being snatched away by the wind. Soon, only one remained. Jacob. He had not moved from his perch on the rock, watching the entire gruesome spectacle with an unnerving stillness. As I dispatched the last of his broken pack, he finally descended, unfolding to his full, terrifying height. He moved towards me, not with the lurching gait of the others, but with a slow, almost mournful grace. This would be different. This was not a rabid animal. This was a fallen king. Our fight was long and grueling. He was impossibly strong, his blows landing with the force of falling trees. He was also cunning, his movements retaining a shadow of the skilled hunter he had once been. He knew my scent, my blood. He seemed to anticipate my attacks, turning aside my lunges, avoiding the killing strikes. He wasn't just fighting. He was testing me, pushing me. At one point, he got through my guard. His claws, hard as steel, raked across my shoulder, tearing through fur and flesh. The pain was white-hot, and with it came the rage. The wolf inside me roared, demanding vengeance, demanding blood. He slammed me to the ground, his gaunt face hovering over mine, and for a terrifying second I felt my control snap. The primal fury surged, a wave of pure, unadulterated violence. My fangs were at his throat, and the coppery tang of his corrupted blood filled my senses. The temptation was overwhelming. To give in, to tear him apart, to revel in the kill. It would be so easy. It was the moment of my own schism, the choice my ancestors had failed to make. But as I looked into those hollow sockets, I saw the man inside. I saw Jacob, and I saw my own reflection in his damnation. With a guttural roar that was more human than wolf, I forced the rage back down. I shoved it into its cage and locked the door. This was not about my fury. It was about his pain. I pushed him off me, not with rage, but with a surge of controlled, focused strength. He staggered back, seemingly surprised. He had expected me to break. He had wanted me to break, perhaps to prove he was not the only one, not the weakest. I rose to my full height, the guardian once more, my mind clear. He came at me one last time, a final, desperate lunge. I did not meet it with force. I stepped inside his reach, my body moving with a fluid grace. My final strike was not a slash or a stab. It was something more akin to an embrace. I drove the silver knife into his chest with a soft, final push. There was no resistance. It was as if his body welcomed it. He shuddered, a long, deep tremor running through his skeletal frame. He looked down at the hilt protruding from his chest, then back up at me. He did not cry out. He simply sagged against me, his immense weight a dead thing. A single rattling sigh escaped his lips, a plume of vapor that looked almost like a soul departing. As my grandfather died in my arms, the blizzard, as if on cue, suddenly ceased. The wind died, the snow stopped falling, and an absolute, profound silence descended upon Burnt Hill. The change receded, draining the strength from my limbs, leaving me human, naked, and trembling in the sudden deafening silence. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and an aching, hollow grief. I gently lowered my grandfather's body to the snow-covered ground. In death, his form seemed smaller, less monstrous, merely a tragic, broken thing. The corpses of my other relatives littered the plateau, dark shapes against the newly pristine white. I had done it. I had ended their suffering. But the victory felt like ashes in my mouth. I knelt there for a long time, the cold seeping into my skin, too weary to move, too empty to feel anything but the immense weight of what I had just done. A crunch of snow behind me. I didn't have the energy to turn. "It's over," a quiet voice said. It was Holloway. He had watched the whole thing. He approached slowly, his pistol holstered, his face pale with shock, but his eyes filled with a strange, somber understanding. He took off his heavy parka and draped it over my shivering shoulders. The simple act of human kindness was so unexpected it almost broke me. "You saved us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You saved the whole county." He looked around at the dead, at the evidence of a battle no one in his world would ever believe. But my God, the cost! I finally found my voice, a ragged croak. "This was just them," I said, looking up at him. "The ones who fell in my grandfather's lifetime. There are others, older ones, walkers who were lost decades ago, before he was even born. The stories, the tally marks in the cave. This curse runs deep." I felt a fresh wave of despair. I had won a single battle in a war that had been raging for centuries. The forest was not clean. My work was not done. Mark Holloway sat down in the snow beside me, a man clearly grappling with the wreckage of his worldview. He was a ranger, a man of rules, of evidence, of the natural order. And he had just witnessed a werewolf perform a mercy killing on a pack of Wendigo in the middle of a blizzard. He was quiet for a long time, watching the gray clouds drift overhead. "For weeks," he finally said, "I've been hunting a monster. I thought maybe it was you, but I was wrong. The monster was a disease. You're the cure." He looked at me, his gaze steady. "You said this is your family's debt to pay. Well, this is my territory to protect. Seems to me our jobs overlap." He offered a hand. "I'll keep the secret. The official report will say we found the culprit. A rogue bear, maybe, that I had to put down. The disappearances will stop, and people will forget. But you and I will know. And if you're going to keep watch over these mountains, you might need someone to keep people from looking too closely. His offer, his acceptance of the impossible, was a lifeline. I was no longer completely alone. A few days later, after the authorities had conducted their cursory investigation and left, satisfied with Holloway's report, I returned to Burnt Hill. I spent 2 days building a memorial. I gathered stones from the mountainside and arranged them in a large, simple circle on the plateau, in the place where my grandfather fell. 1 stone for each of the fallen I had laid to rest. It was not a monument to heroes, but a grave marker for victims, a final acknowledgement of their tragedy. It was a promise that they would not be forgotten, and that their mistakes would not be repeated. Standing within the stone circle as the winter sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow, I renewed my vow. But it was different now. It was not a vow of vengeance or even mercy. It was a vow of endurance. I would not let the lunar hunger win. I would not let the rage consume me. I would not allow another walker to fall, to suffer the schism that had destroyed my lineage. I am the last of my line to know the truth, the final guardian of a terrible legacy. I am broken by what I've had to do, but I am not fallen. My watch continues. As if in response to my thoughts, a sound drifted up from the deep valleys to the north, faint and thin on the wind. It was a high, keening cry, a sound of hunger and despair. It was the call of another one, another lost soul, another forgotten walker stirring in the deep woods. My hunt was not over. It had just begun.